Bloody Sunday soldier faces murder charges. A former British soldier faces murder charges over the killing of 2 people in Londonderry in 1972. The Public Prosecution Service said on Thursday there was enough evidence to prosecute Soldier F for the murders of James Ray and William McKinney. The soldier will also face charges for the attempted murders of Joseph Friel, Michael Quinn, Joe Mann and Patrick O'Donnell. 13 people were shot dead at a civil rights march on January 30, 1972. The PPS said there was insufficient evidence to prosecute 16 other soldiers and 2 official IRA men.
In the archive of the Troubles, the defining images of Bloody Sunday mark a tragic watershed in the annals of the conflict. What happened was coloured by 2 factors: how the army proposed to deal with rioters and the instrument chosen to do it, paratroopers under the command of Colonel Derek Wilford.
We were betrayed, and bringing charges against the soldiers as part of that betrayal.
Just 3 weeks before Bloody Sunday, General Robert Ford met with city traders who demanded the army crack down on rioters who were destroying their business. Ford then wrote a chilling memo in which he said it might be necessary to shoot selected ringleaders once warnings had been given. The plan was to arrest the rioters as they retreated. The Paras were aware that IRA gunmen might be in the flats. I first interviewed Colonel Wilford over 25 years ago. He was disgusted by the passivity of his predecessors.
The soldiers just stood there like Aunt Sally's. I had actually said in public that my soldiers were not going to act as Aunt Sally's, ever.
The scene was set. Colonel Wilford was interviewed when the operation was over and 13 people lay dead.
But the facts are we were fired at first, and we retaliated in the only way which was possible to us.
In 1992, I asked Colonel Wilford if he believed the victims were all innocent.
Oh no, that would be to accept that my soldiers were wrong. It was done as an act, if you like, of war.
But you don't sign your death warrant by taking part in a demonstration.
Some people do.
Almost 20 years after that interview, Lord Savile's epic inquiry into Bloody Sunday concluded that all the victims were innocent and posed no threat to the soldiers. One of the victims was 17-year-old Michael Kelly, shot dead at a barricade near where the Museum of Free Derry now stands. His brother John is its educational officer.
The soldier F just fired a shot and Michael was hit in the stomach and the bullet embedded in his spine.
Do you think that Soldier F will be prosecuted?
I do believe so, because the evidence is so strong against him.
Couldn't a line just be drawn under Bloody Sunday and all the other incidents as they happened so long ago so we can move on?
And you can't draw a line on the murder, and justice has to be seen to be done, no matter how long ago it is.
Derek Wilford is now 85 and has Parkinson's disease. It has ended his work as an artist. Do you now accept what Lord Savile said?
No, I don't. Because I was there. Well, we thought, in fact, that we were under attack. And we will actually remain convinced of that, actually, until the end of our days.
Should your soldiers be prosecuted?
No, they should not. But I don't believe, in fact, that they were capable of that sort of indiscriminate shooting and killing.
Will you say sorry to the families who lost their loved ones that day?
I've said that at the time, and I've said it subsequently. And I see no point in repeating it, because whatever, in fact, I say will be discounted.
What has Bloody Sunday done to you?
I think it destroyed my world.
Far more directly, it destroyed the world of the victims' families. Tomorrow we will know whether prosecuting soldiers will finally bring closure to the tragedy of Bloody Sunday. Peter Taylor, BBC News.
The conflict in Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles, began in the 1960s and lasted for more than 30 years. In 1971, a new law was introduced giving the authorities the power to indefinitely detain people without trial. On the 30th of January 1972, a civil rights march took place in Londonderry in protest. Troops were deployed to the city. The march began shortly after 3 p.m. The intended destination, the Guildhall in Derry city centre. However, army barricades blocked marchers from that area, and the majority of people were directed towards Free Derry Corner in the Bogside. Some protesters lagged behind, and after skirmishes between young people and the army, paratroopers moved in to make arrests. Just before 4 p.m, stones were thrown and soldiers responded with rubber bullets, tear gas and water cannon. At 7 minutes past 4, soldiers made their way down William Street with orders to arrest as many marchers as possible. A short time later, soldiers began to open fire on people in the Rossville Street area. According to army evidence, 21 soldiers fired their weapons on Bloody Sunday, shooting 108 live rounds between them. 13 people were killed on that day and 15 people were wounded. 2 investigations have been held. In April 1972, the Widgery Tribunal largely cleared the soldiers and British authorities of blame, and the report was widely criticised as a whitewash. More than 20 years later, in 1998, the Savile Inquiry was set up to establish a definitive version of events. It cost more than £190 million and answered a number of key questions regarding innocent civilians. That report was published in 2010. The then Prime Minister David Cameron apologised.
The government is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the armed forces, and for that, on behalf of the government, indeed on behalf of our country, I am deeply sorry.
Some have criticised the cost of the Savile Inquiry, but the Bloody Sunday families have been calling for accountability, justice and closure for many years.
Good morning, you're watching Sky News. We start with breaking news. The Public Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland has decided that one former British soldier should be prosecuted for their role in the Bloody Sunday killings.
But they say there is insufficient evidence to bring charges against 18 other suspects. 13 civilians were killed when British paratroopers opened fire on a civil rights march in Londonderry in January of 1972.
Well, let's go straight there and our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins. David, there were 17 soldiers and 2 former members of the Provisional IRA that were being investigated over deaths in that day. One is going to be brought to prosecution, we now know. What will the reaction be of the families of those who died on that day?
Well, the families have been meeting privately with the Public Prosecution Service for the last hour. We expect them to come here to the Guildhall in the centre of Londonderry shortly, where they will hold a press conference. But I suspect there will be considerable disappointment, given that 47 years after the shooting dead of 13 people and wounding of 15 others by members of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, on that day that became known as Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, public prosecutors have reached the conclusion that there is sufficient evidence to charge one soldier, Soldier F. Remember, there is an anonymity order in place. We cannot give you that soldier's name, and he will be charged with the murders of James Ray and William McKinney, and be charged with the attempted murders of Joseph Friel, Michael Quinn, Joe Mahon and Patrick O'Donnell. So one soldier facing murder and attempted murder charges, but the Public Prosecution Service says there is insufficient evidence to charge the other 16 former members of that regiment who were involved in this incident on that day back in January 1972.
It's cost literally millions and taken 47 years to get this far. Is this the end of the road for those families with any prospect of any legal action?
Well, it's very difficult to see where they go next, but I suspect they will continue with their pursuit of justice. This is indeed the end of a very lengthy police investigation and a very lengthy consideration of a mountain of material by public prosecutors. 668 statements, numerous physical exhibits, photographs, video, audio recordings, somewhere in the region of 125,000 pages of material. The family always said that the public inquiry that took place here, it was the longest running and most expensive the UK has ever seen, had vindicated the victims of Bloody Sunday. Lord Savile concluded at the end of that process that the killings had been unjustified and unjustifiable. They said that was the moment of truth, but they would continue to pursue justice. So I do indeed speculate that they are going to be very disappointed when they face the cameras here within the next hour at the Guildhall.
And David, given what's happening with Brexit, given the lack of Stormont at the moment, how fragile is the peace in Northern Ireland, and will this result today have any bearing on it?
Well, it is in a vulnerable place, there's no doubt about that, because of the focus on the Irish border and the sense of partition again that has been emphasised by the debate about what happens post-Brexit between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It's also worth reminding people that the threat posed by dissident Republicans in Northern Ireland has never been deemed less than severe, despite the fact that it has been reduced in the rest of the United Kingdom. This decision will, I suppose, be debated. It will cause real division among the politicians. But in a way, all of that has to take a back seat right now to the judicial process, because this one charge is this one soldier to be charged will lead to him being brought here to Northern Ireland and appearing in a court in due course. I think it's worth explaining to people that he will not be arrested today. He will be charged by means of indictable summons, and what that means is that he will be summoned to appear before magistrates, probably somewhere in the region of Derry, within the next few weeks. And that's going to be another very significant moment. But for today, I suppose the focus will be on the families and how they're going to respond to this news. I suppose the veterans organisations who've been expressing concern about how these historical cases are being handled will be relieved to some extent. But for Soldier F, murder charges and attempted murder charges, and that is a significant development coming 47 years after this event in Northern Ireland, which was, of course, a real turning point in terms of the troubles here.
And David, we have reflected on the families, and you touched on it there, the impact on this particular soldier. There will be those who will look at what happened in Northern Ireland and will say, why, after 47 years, are these charges able to be put retrospectively? What impact does that have on the army? People who, many within the army will argue, are simply doing their job.
Yes, I think it is worth reminding people, Jane, that Operation Banner, the deployment of British troops onto the streets of Northern Ireland, began in 1969, didn't come to an end until 2007. At any given time, there were 21,000 soldiers deployed here. There was never more than 10,000 deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that puts it into context for you. But over that period of time, it means somewhere in the region of 300,000 soldiers served on the streets of Northern Ireland during this period we call the Troubles, and they've been considering themselves vulnerable in recent weeks because of attempt to bring prosecution. But for the families of those who died at the hands of British forces, they believe that their loved ones are entitled to justice and they want their killings properly investigated. That's what they've demanded all along, and they continue to make that demand. But I think Bloody Sunday, more than any other event, really is really was the watershed moment in that period of history. Worth just summarising again, 13 people were shot dead and 15 people wounded by members of the Parachute Regiment while they were taking part in a civil rights march in this city. And it marked a turning point. You'll remember that iconic image of Bishop Edward Daly, the Catholic bishop of this city, waving his blood-stained handkerchief as he escorted the body of one of the victims along. Later in his memoirs, he reported that countless young people had decided on that day to become involved in the armed struggle, and that resulted in them signing up to join the ranks of the Provisional IRA. That's how significant a moment he considered Bloody Sunday to have been. And I think it was so enshrined in the Republican psyche that when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, right back at the beginning, I suppose, of of the Northern Ireland peace process, or the culmination of the Northern Ireland peace process, the very first thing Sinn Féin demanded of the new Labour government was a fresh public inquiry into the shootings in Londonderry on the 30th of January 1972. And that did result in the longest running and most expensive public inquiry the UK's ever seen, somewhere in the region of £195 million. And the relatives of those who died that day were relieved by Lord Savile's finding that the killings were unjustified and unjustifiable. They felt that the victims had been completely exonerated when the then Prime Minister David Cameron apologised in the House of Commons to them. So to some extent this is a setback for them, and they will be disappointed, and we await their response when they arrive here at the Guildhall, probably sometime in the next few minutes.
David, thanks very much for that. We will return to you when the families do arrive there. Thank you.
Well, David's touched on this, but let's just take you through the sequence of events as they happened. On the 30th of January 1972, 13 people were killed when those British soldiers opened fire on civil rights demonstrators in Londonderry.
Well, a hastily produced report by Lord Widgery, which exonerated the army, was widely seen as a whitewash.
Well, that led to a long-running campaign by victims' families for a public inquiry, as David was just saying. In January 1998, 26 years after the events of Bloody Sunday, the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, granted them their wish and granted a public inquiry.
Well, the Savile inquiry took 12 years, and in June 2010, Lord Savile ruled that the shootings were unjustified, leading to Prime Minister David Cameron making a public apology. Let's just take you live across to Londonderry. You can see there families of some of those who died on that day back in 1972. They have marched this morning from the nationalist Bogside area up to the Guildhall in Derry with photographs of the loved ones who passed away on that day. We're going to be hearing a press conference from this bunch of families in the next few minutes. We'll bring that to you live when they are ready to speak to the cameras.
Yeah, we'll stay on those pictures, and as we do that, let's go live to central London, and there we can speak to Kevin Rooney, co-author of a book called The Blood-Stained Poppy. It looks at the misdeeds, alleged or otherwise, of British soldiers, not just in Northern Ireland but elsewhere as well. Kevin Rooney, welcome to you. Our correspondent in Derry today making the point that what happened in 1972 was a turning point in the Troubles.
Yeah, I think it was. I think one of the things that I would like to clarify is that what happened on Bloody Sunday wasn't a few rotten apples. I think when British soldiers came to the north of Ireland, they seen the nationalist population as a suspect population, as the enemy in many ways, and they were sent out by their military and political leaders to try to subdue and stop nationalist campaigning for civil rights and for United Ireland. And as I sit here today and speak to you in Ballymurphy, housing estate in West Belfast where I come from, there's an inquest in Belfast right now where paratroopers murdered or shot dead in cold blood 10 people. So this Bloody Sunday wasn't a one-off in many respects. It's the one that most people in Britain know about. But the point is this: as much as the British soldiers carried out many, many atrocities and murders of innocent people, many, many, many hundreds, the really difficult question that has to be asked, does there come a time when we have to draw a line under this? And whether you be a British soldier who killed someone, or an IRA volunteer who killed someone, or a loyalist, are we going to say that it's time to move on? Yes, well, let's try
Kevin,
and get the truth.
Yeah. Help us draw a line, an historical line. I mean, presumably there will. This was 1972. Sure. There will have been members of the British 1st Battalion British Parachute Regiment there on the streets of Derry, who may have seen action, for instance, in Korea, the Malayan emergency. Sure. That's not impossible. They'd have seen colleagues killed in combat that have been veterans themselves. Would we, where's the line? Is it Malaya? Is it Korea? Is it 47 years ago? What's the test? Living relatives?
Well, I mean, it's a brilliant, brilliant question, right? And in a way, it's a political decision that the people of the north of Ireland, and to an extent Britain, have to work out. I don't think you can find a legal solution to what is a political problem. Now, this is extremely difficult for families. The families who've lost loved ones absolutely want truth about what happened to their loved ones. Some of those families still want people jailed. My point is, and your correspondent made the point, after Bloody Sunday, many young Republicans in the Bogside joined the IRA and themselves killed British soldiers or carried out bombings. I don't want those young Republicans who are now in their 50s or 60s or 70s hunted down by PSNI or British intelligence and put before a court. I actually don't even want loyalists put up before a court who murdered innocent Catholics. I personally think the time is now to draw a line.
And yet we have a prosecution, so that decision has been taken. But when we look back to that moment 47 years ago, reflect on this, Kevin. This was a unit of the British Army which had a reputation for being really at the pointed end of the spear in combat terms,
right.
And it was called upon to conduct a police action, and in a sense it was always an ill fit.
Well, you're right. I mean, I was reading just recently General Sir Mike Jackson, one of the British Army generals. He made the point that he himself thought that they were sent to Derry to teach the nicest a lesson, that he himself thought that the British Army had certain regiments that would crack heads, as he put it. And they went into Derry, and beforehand, 4 or 5 months beforehand, those same British soldiers had carried out the murders in Ballymurphy, where 10 people were shot dead in cold blood. Now, it's hard for your viewers to get a grip of this, that British soldiers went in to nicest areas and terrorised people and killed people and shot people. Now, that happened, but my point is this: the war is over. The war is over, and I don't excuse what British soldiers done. In fact, I've written a book condemning them and criticising them. But I think the really profound, and it's an incredibly profound question I'm about to pose, is there a moment when people in the north of Ireland and Britain have to say, time to move on? And as unpopular as that might make me amongst some of the nationalist people in Belfast where I come from, I think that British soldier should not spend one day in jail. I don't think anybody in the IRA should spend another day in jail. We have a peace process. Let's move on. Let the young generation move the north of Ireland forward.
Yeah. Kevin, what do you say to the relatives of the 185 or thereabouts soldiers killed in Northern Ireland who had no investigation into their deaths? And, you know, as a journalist, as a young journalist, you know, did a couple of trips to Northern Ireland out with the young, very often very young infantrymen who were patrolling streets in fear of their lives or serious injury.
Sure.
What's the message to those families who say this isn't equal justice, it's politics?
Yeah, I think it is politics, but the first point, I want to nail a mistruth that Karen Bradley, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has been perpetuating, and Theresa May stood up in the House of Commons and said it, that somehow this was there was an imbalance, and somehow the scales were stacked against British soldiers and Republicans that somehow got off lightly. That's an absolute nonsense. Any journalist who goes and looks at the facts will see that that was just a simple mistruth, which elements of the British media have carried uncritically. As for the relatives of British soldiers, people can look at the Troubles in whatever way they wish. It was a war. There was a conflict. The British Army were taking on the IRA. And guess what? The IRA went out to kill British soldiers. And British soldiers went out in the orders of their masters to kill IRA volunteers and sometimes nicest residents. Now, I completely understand the desire of those relatives to want to get at the truth, but I have to say, honestly, does there come a time when as much as we need to allow a certain space and element of time and effort to find out as much details and the truth of the various incidents that happened in the north of Ireland, can we say that there is a moment when we have to draw a line and move on? Now, that's a philosophical and a political question, or point I'm throwing at. And I know there'll be people watching Sky News right now, and they will be sick to their stomachs when they hear me say this very point. But we do face a fork in the road here in the north of Ireland about where we go. There's no doubt whatsoever that the British soldiers and military, and the orders of their military masters, murdered innocent people. But can we at some point say that happened and we move on? Because what we're going to end up is with political point scoring. Already you see the political parties in Northern Ireland using certain killings and incidents to score points against the other side. And it is possible, if no one's about to stand up and challenge this could go on for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years until all of that generation of people die out.
Kevin, we're just going to pause there and say thank you for now, at least. Kevin Rooney is the co-author of The Bloodstained Poppy, and we're going to go back to Derry Jane.
Yeah, David Blevins is down there. You can see family members there gathering on the steps. Just before we cross to David, just to let you know, a couple of lines coming from the Ministry of Defence, which says that the government will urgently reform the system for dealing with legacy issues, obviously in light of what has happened today. The Ministry of Defence says we're indebted to those soldiers who served with courage and distinction to bring peace to Northern Ireland after the Bloody Sunday ruling. And they say our serving and former personnel cannot live in constant fear of prosecution. Let's cross to David Blevins. David, you've got some reaction from the family already.
Yes, that's very interesting, the statement from the Ministry of Defence, because it really conflicts with the statement we've just received from the families. They're about to hold a press conference here at the Guildhall, but they are saying this is a remarkable achievement by the families, notwithstanding the unprecedented attempted political interference with the independence of the judicial process. The families have not only succeeded in consigning the Widgery report to history, that was the original inquiry into Bloody Sunday, and securing the complete vindication and declaration of innocence of the victims. They've now secured the prosecution of Soldier F for the murder and attempted murder of 6 innocent people. They say they are disappointed that not all of those responsible are to face trial, but this is the key part of their statement. They say they will give detailed consideration to the reasons provided for decisions not to prosecute the other soldiers, with a view to making further submissions to the prosecution service, and will ultimately challenge in the High Court, by way of judicial review, any prosecutorial decision that does not withstand scrutiny. So to summarise that very simply, they're going to ask the Public Prosecution Service to look again at some of the evidence, to give a detailed explanation for why these soldiers are not being prosecuted, and if they're unhappy with the answer they get, they're going to challenge that in the High Court by way of judicial review.
OK, David, thanks very much for that. We are seeing those families gathering there. I mean, it is an extraordinary amount of evidence that has been looked at by the Police Service of Northern Ireland that's been handed across to the Northern Ireland Public Prosecution Service. The police did launch a murder investigation after the Savile inquiry. 668 pages of witness statements were taken, 125,000 pages of material relating to these soldiers, the 17 former British soldiers and 2 former members of the IRA.
And in fact, I mean, I remember broadcasting actually with David Blevins from that very position back in 2010 on the day that David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, described the actions on Bloody Sunday as unjustifiable. There were thumbs up that day from inside the Guildhall. This the scene some 9 years on. The Savile inquiry, to some degree, became a byword for public inquiries that had run a little bit out of control. Nearly £200 million in 12 years spent, and as Jane was saying, a colossal pile of paperwork as well. Let's just go back briefly as you look at these pictures again and talk to Kevin Rooney, the co-author of a book called The Blood-Stained Poppy, who's advocating, Kevin, a position that won't win universal support, but you are saying there has to be a line eventually drawn under Bloody Sunday.
I think so. It's as simple as that. I've huge respect for the Bloody Sunday families. They fought a long, hard battle after the whitewash of the Widgery Tribunal, which basically absolved British soldiers of any responsibility. And when Savile came out, I was delighted for the families that the truth came out. But I do think that if we're not careful, the politics of the north of Ireland could be dominated by different political parties trying to score points of each other in relation to various atrocities or killings that were carried out. And there's a young generation coming up, and really the question is for that young generation, at what point do we have to say enough is enough? I'm all for clarifying what happened in incidents and for the truth. But I have to repeat, I don't think any person should spend another day in jail for what happened in the Troubles, because we have a question to answer. Is the conflict over or is it not? And if it is over, let's move on.
Kevin, give us a sense, if you can, thinking back to the early 1970s, of the scale of the British Army deployment in Northern Ireland. Our correspondent was making the point that it was double, 3 times even, the biggest deployment in, say, Afghanistan. And it wasn't just a deployment involving tens of thousands of service personnel, but it rolled on relentlessly year after year.
It was completely huge. I mean, if you look in so I grew up in West Belfast, in what you call Greater Ballymurphy, New Barnsley area, and I can remember as a young person, I kid you not, we had tanks, literally tanks, with Caterpillar tracks going up and down what was the main road, what was supposedly part of Britain. I mean, the military vehicles, the checkpoints, it was a completely militarised society. And back then, you would have had constant gun battles and huge amounts of explosions and conflict in different areas of the north of Ireland. And what was at stake was the constitutional status of the north of Ireland was at stake. There was a war.
But, yeah, Kevin, just to interrupt, I mean, I know what you make the point about constitutional status, but if you talk to the young soldiers who were patrolling, fearful of blast bombs and snipers' bullets and all the rest of it, they went there with a narrative which was British Army called in to keep two rival camps apart who were tearing each other's throats out, and they were there to keep the peace.
Yeah, I know. I mean, and basically, that's precisely the myth that I'm trying to nail. And a long time ago, in years gone by, a very compliant British media would have presented the British soldiers as these neutral referees in the middle between these warring parties. And what I'm effectively trying to say to you is, if you go back to Bloody Sunday, they were actually marching that demonstration for equal rights because nationalists didn't have equal rights at the time. And what I'm trying to say to you is, the nationalists were seen as a potential threat to the status of Northern Ireland, and I think that's why they were treated so harshly at the time.
OK, Kevin, we appreciate you staying on. We're going to go back to Derry right now.
So this is the Guildhall in Londonderry. This is where... So this is the Guildhall in Londonderry. This is where families of those who died in the Bloody Sunday on the 30th of January 1972 have gathered. They've marched from the Bogside area to this venue today. They've heard what the Director of Public Prosecutions in Northern Ireland has said, that one soldier out of the 17 that were investigated and 2 members of the IRA that were investigated will be prosecuted or can be prosecuted, that there is enough evidence to bring a prosecution. That is Soldier F, for 2 counts of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The families say that they are pleased that this case has been brought, but they are disappointed that more of those who are responsible have not been charged. Now we can hear from the Chief Prosecutor of Northern Ireland, Stephen Heron.
I am acutely aware that it has been a long road for the families to reach this point, and today will be another extremely difficult day for many of them. As prosecutors, we approach our responsibilities with complete impartiality, but not without compassion for all those who are impacted by our decisions. There was perhaps a level of expectation around the prosecution decisions in light of the findings of the Bloody Sunday inquiry, but I would highlight 2 important distinctions. First, much of the material which was available for consideration by the inquiry is not admissible in criminal proceedings due to the strict rules of evidence that apply. Therefore, most of the previous statements as to conduct made by the soldiers cannot be used against the individual concerned as a basis for prosecution. Second, the inquiry reached a number of findings couched in terms of probability, which is substantially different to the standard of proof required in criminal cases of beyond reasonable doubt. Having outlined these points, I would stress that the prosecution decisions in no way undermine the finding of the inquiry that those killed or injured were not posing a threat to any of the soldiers. Today, we have outlined the reasoning for our decisions with families, and we are committed to further engagement to help them understand those reasons. In the interest of openness and transparency, we are also publishing a summary on our website. This is intended to provide the public with a high level of confidence in the independence and integrity of our decision making. I would remind everyone to please exercise caution when commenting on today's decisions. There are significant reporting restrictions still in place from the Bloody Sunday inquiry, And as criminal proceedings are now to be commenced, there should be no reporting which could prejudice these in any way.
Well, that there, the Chief Prosecutor for Northern Ireland, Stephen Heron, explaining why they have reached the conclusion that they did, why one soldier has faced prosecution when there were 17 soldiers who were being examined and 2 members of the IRA. And let's bring in our Ireland correspondent, David Blevins, again. And David, he makes the point that there is much information out there. A great deal of information was put into the public domain during the Bloody Sunday inquiry with Lord Savile, but a lot of it is not admissible in criminal proceedings.
That's right, and I think Stephen Heron has been acutely aware that despite the fact one soldier is to face charges, another 16 will not, and that's disappointing for the families. So he's attempting to explain the reason for that decision, pointing out that the level of expectation around the prosecution was perhaps raised because of the findings of the Bloody Sunday inquiry. But as you say, those findings were not admissible because Lord Savile persuaded people to give evidence to his independent public inquiry, which lasted the best part of 10 years, on the basis that that evidence could not be used in any future prosecution. But it's important to say he's also stressing that his finding in relation to these charges should not take away in any way from what was said by the Bloody Sunday inquiry.
To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Individuals out there, but he's now been put in the frame for 2, which is Willie McKinney and Jim Ray, and their injury of 4 others. So their victory is our victory. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity, said Nelson Mandela. We have walked a long journey since our fathers and brothers were brutally slaughtered on the streets of Derry on Bloody Sunday. Over that passage of time, all the parents of the deceased have died. We are here to take their place. Bloody Sunday was not just a wanton act carried out by a trained army against defenceless civil rights activists. It also created a deep legacy of hurt and injustice, and deepened and prolonged a bloody conflict unimaginable even in those dark winter days of 1972. The full cost of a Bloody Sunday cannot be measured just in terms of those who suffered that day, but must also be measured in terms of those who suffered because of that terrible day. We have just been informed of this series of charges, and they're easy to read. One soldier, Soldier F, multiple murderer, has been charged with 2 murders and 4 attempted murders.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. We, the families of the murdered and wounded in Derry on Bloody Sunday, today heard the decision by the PPS to charge just one British paratrooper for his murderous actions on the 30th of January 1972. This announcement is further vindication of our decades-long campaign to clear the names of our loved ones and to bring those responsible for their deaths and injuries to justice. When the Bloody Sunday Justice campaign was launched in 1992, we had 3 clear demands: to have the Widgery whitewash overturned and replaced by an independent inquiry, to gain a formal acknowledgement of the innocence of all our loved ones, and to prosecute those responsible. With today's news, we now achieve our 3rd aim.
Good morning, everyone. However, we have also faced the disappointing news that in some cases there will not be prosecutions. And we are mindful of those families who received that news today. And believe me, there are many. We would like to remind everyone that no prosecution, or if it comes to it, no conviction, does not mean not guilty. It does not mean that no crime was committed. It does not mean that those soldiers acted in a dignified and appropriate way. It simply means that if these crimes have been investigated properly when they happened, and evidence gathered at the time, then the outcome would have been different. We note that Lord Saville's report findings on the actions of soldiers that day, that all the casualties were either the intended targets of the soldiers or the result of shots fired indiscriminately at people, that no soldiers fired in response to attacks or threatened attacks, that no soldiers fired in a state of panic, and that soldiers opened fire either in the belief that no one in the area towards which they respectfully fired was posing a threat or causing death or serious injury, or not caring whether or not anyone there was posing such a threat. These are not the sort of comments levelled at innocent people. The passage of time have made charges difficult in this case and in other cases, but the passage of time should not be used as a form of blanket immunity to block proper investigations. Everyone deserves justice, including those whose loved ones were murdered by the British state. There can be no substitute of limitations, there can be no statute of limitations used to deny justice, no new laws to protect state killers. But for us here today, it is important to point out that justice for one family is justice for all of us. We stand in full solidarity with those of us whose loved one's death or injury has not been included in the announcement of prosecutions. We also stand to complete the solidarity with the hundreds of families who have had to endure decades without an inquest, without a criminal investigation, and who have been left to struggle for their basic human right to justice. We hope our campaign continues to be an inspiration to them.
Good morning. Today's decision, although 47 years overdue, is the right one if we are to uphold the rule of law and hold perpetrators accountable for their crimes. However, we also say that the scope of the new police investigation was not wide enough, and we assert that the repeated failure to properly investigate the actions of those who planted nail bombs on the body of my uncle, 17-year-old Gerard Donaghy, is unacceptable. The Saville report left a stain on Gerard's innocence that this investigation could have removed, but it did not do so. We repeat our call for this injustice to be addressed. And while we as a group of families and individuals may have differing views on whether or not the soldiers who carried out the shootings should face jail, or how long they should spend in jail, we are all agreed that they should face the due process of the law. And they should do so in public. The very few British soldiers that were charged during the conflict here were named, and the same should apply to those being charged now. Killers should not benefit from anonymity. We maintain that key individuals in the army, in politics and beyond should also be held to account for their actions on that day and afterwards. This affront must also be rectified if justice is to be truly done and seen to be done. If the police officer in charge on the day of the Hillsborough tragedy can face prosecution, then so too can those who were in charge on Bloody Sunday. There cannot be one law for the military and political elite and one law for the others. Thank you.
Finally, there should be no further delay in dealing with the outstanding demand of the families of Bloody Sunday and the people of Derry. We call on all those who will administer the next stage to move with all speed to bring this to a conclusion. We call on all involved to cooperate fully and not indulge in any more delaying tactics. We call on the Crown Prosecution Service to complete this process and reach a decision on whether or not anyone is to be charged with perjury in relation to their evidence to the Bloody Sunday inquiry. We call on the Attorney-General to investigate recent comments about these prosecutions being made by prominent politicians, including the British Minister of Defence, and decide if they too broke the law. If they have, they should be charged. They cannot attempt to interfere in the judicial process just because they don't like it, or because their voters don't like it. The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is the duty of the living to do so for them. We have cried out for them for many years, and now we have succeeded for them. Do not deny us justice any longer. Thank you. We will continue on and hopefully get the rest of the perpetrators to justice because of their legal means to actually get them prosecuted and bring them before the courts. So the campaign, the Bloody Sunday families, are not finished yet.